Today I'm talking to Professor William Latham, who is not only a Professor of Computing at Goldsmiths College, but is also an internationally famous artist specialising in generative or algorithmic art. People use several terms to describe the sort of art that we're interested in. I mean, digital art, new media art, computer art, and very, very more besides. Do you have any particularly strong feelings for or against any of those?
I'm fine with all those terms. I guess new media art is the kind of trendy term that's emerged, which sort of covers video art and installation art, so it's a bit sort of more art world friendly. Digital art, I'm fine with, or computer art, often what I'm described as being a computer artist. So I don't really mind that much.
Would you mind just summarising your own contribution to digital art? I mean, it's quite extensive, but if you could just take us through.
Okay. So I guess I started working with computers in the early days when I was at Oxford University, using kind of Benson plotters to draw out these large geometric drawings that were sort of inspired by Russian constructivism, and that was before I went to the Royal College of Art in 1979, where I did an MA and then a PhD. So I guess to answer your question, the history goes back that far. I guess probably my contribution is being one of the lead figures around evolutionary art, which coincided with Richard Dawkins' work on the biomorph system, Carl Sims in the US, and myself. We were sort of all working in parallel on using evolutionary techniques. So if you look in the history books, that's sort of probably what I'm best known for. And that led to a lot of art influenced by us as a group.
And you've now moved into virtual reality as well, haven't you? You've just come back from showing off Mutator in Düsseldorf.
Yes. So I spent about 10 years in the computer games industry, running a company of 70 people after doing some work initially in the music industry, where they were keen on using my imagery for rave music. But recently I'm sort of, during the past 3 years, I'm sort of back making major VR work again, and that's opened up a whole range of new possibilities that just we couldn't even consider back in the late 80s when I was at IBM. There was just no way we could do anything of this type, particularly in real time at 90 frames a second. So I guess VR, from my point of view, has meant that I, rather than being consigned to the history books for that work I did in the late 80s and early 90s, I'm back doing really brand new work for many years now.
And you're also a professor here at Goldsmiths, aren't you?
Yes.
Computing?
Yes, I'm a professor here in computing, and I'm involved with a number of different research projects. So I have a team with me producing the artwork, and that's the other thing. I'm in many ways the front man. I've got 2 or 3 brilliant individuals working with me, in particular Stephen Todd, who I worked with since the time I was at IBM, and Lance Putnam from the US, and I have 2 really good PhD students. So yeah, I'm really lucky, and Goldsmiths has been great.
And you're doing some fairly cutting-edge research into biomedical applications, aren't you? Or
yes.
Visualizing them or using them as generative, what's the word, formulae, algorithms, something like that.
Yes, so in fact, going right the way back to when I was at IBM, the IBM Scientific Centre that I was based in was doing work with molecular graphics, and the first version of Mutator, which was about 1990, was based on an adapted protein structure, which Stephen Todd adapted to be a parameterized art structure that I could use. So the work has always had this close relationship with science. So moving forward several decades, we've now got our Mutator VR art experience running, but in parallel we have the version for DNA and RNA. We're doing work with viruses, now putting the viewer right inside the center of a virus. And again, there's quite a lot of common geometry between what we're doing in computer evolutionary art and what's happening in the kind of molecular space, particularly around constraints and visualization and simulation.
You started off Well, let me ask you a question. Did you start off as a sort of traditional artist and then become interested in computers, or did you start off from a computing background and become interested in art, or which?
So my background is I originally trained as an artist. I went to the Ruskin School of Drawing at Oxford. I was always interested in computing, and my father was a chemist, so he worked for SO doing chemical experiments and things like that. So I was always interested in the kind of systems art, and the early work was more influenced by Russian constructivism and people like Kenneth Martin and systems art. And then I gradually got involved with software.
And then you went to the RCA, didn't you?
Yes, yeah.
I mean, the historically, from what I read, there was quite a lot of hostility in the grander art schools at one time to computers in the art room. Did you experience that at all?
Yes, the fine art department, the painting school had people doing wonderful paintings like Julian Schnabel and Baselit, very passionate, and there I was doing these sort of process-driven biro drawings, which were these giant evolutionary trees. So there was a definite conflict. It's only now, during the past 5 years, that everyone's jumped on the kind of new media computer bandwagon. Back then there was very, very few people working with computers at all. There was a lot of hostility, but it was a different era. There were no mobile phones, there were fax machines, no one, PCs weren't around, no one really had laptops at all. So it was a very different era going back to that time.
So you were conscious of being something of a pioneer?
Probably, yes. Yeah, I was always engaged in some friction with the art world, which has never gone away. I guess like all things, you do it because it's interesting. And definitely the evolutionary drawings I was doing at the Royal College of Art started to get interest even back then. But yeah, there's always been this tension with traditional art.
You've spoken about a return to the Renaissance situation where art and science were working hand in hand and closely together. Do you think we're getting nearer to that sort of situation today?
So right from the beginning, once we'd created the mutator evolutionary art system, the computer became quite quickly a kind of creative partner working with me. So I would hit the mutate button and it would generate 32 variants quite quickly that were using the grammar that we'd developed, kind of rich geometry, and it would always come back with something surprising. And that to me is what's really interesting about using a computer, is it gives you back something you wouldn't expect. And then we'd crossbreed, I'd take two that I liked, crossbreed again. And so in effect, the machine was doing half the creative work and I was doing the other half. And the other idea was to remove all the labor. So for ray tracing, with cast shadows, beautiful reflections, that would take hours and hours painting at an easel like a Dutch still life painter. So the idea was that we could get things looking like a Dutch still life painting, but being rendered by the computer as fast as it could.
But you talked about imposing your own aesthetic. When
yes.
the computer came up with a mutation, you would choose on some basis whether it was like a paisley pattern or like a Greek helmet or something like that.
Yes.
You would choose which survived.
Yes. So what happens is when I'm picking and breeding, it's evolution by aesthetic. So my aesthetic is deciding what survives to be bred for again and what's destroyed. So, but when one is looking at 32 forms and saying, well, that one top right is the best, the human brain is working on two levels. One is it's doing like a Rorschach ink block test. It's looking for content. So the one top right might remind you of antlers or ammonites or a beautiful shell, and all the others look pretty messy. They don't look anything. But then also my belief is the human is also making some clear design decisions, like not too dark, not too light, good range of colours. So what we're now doing at Goldsmiths is we're now trying to automate that process to completely remove me from remove me entirely. And so I've got a very good PhD student who's called Guido, who's working with me on that, so that the aesthetics is entirely done by the machine. And the question is whether the machine can do the ink blot test. And the ink blot test is fantastic in that the human eye can see gnomes or Freudian content. What doesn't really matter. The brain, in our brains, we're like an extremely fast processor for handling that type of information extraction.
Yes, you mentioned in an interview that the computer can see shapes, but it can't necessarily see the symbolism of, say, a picture. I think you used the example of a griffin or a unicorn or something like that.
Yes.
It can see the shape, but it doesn't know about the associations.
Yes, and I think what's interesting is that as one tries to get a computer to recognise a griffin or a witch on a broomstick, we learn more and more about what we as humans are doing. It may be that the machine cannot perform that task, but we're trying. We're just trying to see what can be done on that front.
It's very interesting, the idea that you might have, in effect, a completely artificial intelligence aesthetics, really, and this came up in, I think, in the 50s with the Ulm school.
Yes.
I can't remember the name of the person who came up with it, but the idea being that one day not only would machines generate art, they would also decide what was good art,
Yes.
what was aesthetically pleasing, what was aesthetically satisfying, and it's a fascinating idea. I'm not sure it's found its time yet exactly.
But the computer could give more interesting content back to the viewer than the human would by themselves, particularly if the human is already in a VR experience. The machine is delivering VR worlds, alternate worlds for the human to consume.
Yes.
That to me is an interesting idea. It maybe will undermine how people's perception of how great creativity is. If a machine can make aesthetic decisions, what is the role of the artist? But in some ways, one can't resist but to try and unravel this puzzle. That's kind of what's interesting, is to try and understand that. But definitely the mutator framework gives us a very nice system which we're now applying machine learning techniques to see if we can emulate the artist, or at least generate an alternative artist.
Thank you. Let's pause there for a moment. You've said somewhere that art has been reduced to a form of real estate. I mean, would you care to comment on further on that? Sorry.
I guess the challenge of the relation, the contemporary art world. My personal feeling is that what we're seeing with ready-made art, with Jeff Koons, Damien Hirst, Chapman twins is purely a rehash of what Marcel Duchamp did extremely well in 1911, or the urinal. So he did it extremely well then. And why 100 years later we're still rehashing the same concept? It's the joker's kind of worn thin at this point. So to me, the computer, which is the device which is changing the world, is the vehicle to use to make art. It's just blatantly obvious. Now, ultimately, I think is by using the computer, because now so many people are using computers, you will ultimately produce art that people will enjoy because they'll understand the medium. But to me, getting involved with machine learning and evolutionary systems and DNA and RNA is extremely rich territory. Sticking some dead animal in a tank is just not going anywhere. It's also non-intellectual, and in some ways it's quite fetishistic. In some ways, it's taking something and fetishizing it. So, I think that's one of the problems with contemporary art, is this kind of return to something that's actually happened many years ago. And it's been, I read a couple of reports actually that as things become more digital, people will actually want more things that are handmade, like the rise of the super chef and things like that. They're all examples of human activity being exalted in some form.
It does seem to me that there are different spheres, if you like, of digital art. There are people like yourself and Michael Takeo Magruder, for example, who make big things,
Yes.
which involve a lot of work and a lot of science and a lot of thought, and are typically site-specific installations.
Yeah.
But, and are mostly funded by large organisations, whether they're galleries or museums or whatever, or companies sometimes.
Yeah.
And then there are people who do things that either sell in galleries or are just done for the hell of it with no commercial thought behind it. I mean, I think there are a lot of digital artists still who see themselves as being non-commercial.
Yeah.
But the art world is evolving fantastic ways, interesting ways anyway, of monetising all sorts of art. I mean, can you see your own ever being monetised and selling through an art gallery?
Maybe. At the moment, I've been able to remain independent by winning research grants in the science domain, which helps the art. So I've been fiercely independent, never compromised what I'm doing. I mean, I'm lucky that I'm in a university environment, and it creates a great environment for me to do my work. Yes, there is a sort of a tension between. It seems to be there are two paths. You either go down the gallery route or you go down the research work. And right from the start, when I went to IBM Scientific Centre, I was going down the research work path. So at that point, IBM sponsored me for 6 years to produce an art as an artist backed by IBM. The question is whether, for this type of work, it's a bit like an artist at the time of the Medici, you would be sponsored by the King of Prussia or whatever, and whether artists, for example, at Goldsmiths, we've had students who've done, PhD students who've done placements with Microsoft and Google DeepMind, or Carl Sims was at Thinking Machines and Kawaguchi was at Nippon Electronics, that you're either in a situation where you're sponsored by a company or a research grant because they're interested in the ideas, they're interested in the intellectual property that might have emerged from it, or you go the art world route where you're kind of dancing the tango that the art world want. So I guess I've gone the kind of corporate research route.
It changes the gatekeepers in a way, doesn't it? I mean, if you want to do a work, you have to find one set of sponsors, whereas other people would find a different set.
Yes, it's all around sponsors. I think being in the research area is much more exciting because you're in pursuit of knowledge. Certainly the teams that we're working with, Oxford Weatherall Institute and Imperial College, they talk about being at the frontier of knowledge. Literally, they don't know what's happening at a cellular level or lower, and that's really interesting. You get that sort of real excitement.
I suppose the elephant in the room really is the question of money. Would you like to comment on how your own creative practice has been funded?
Okay, so I've had an interesting path. And so, as I mentioned, I was at IBM for 6 years, funded 100% by IBM, flying around the world, doing exhibitions that toured Japan, UK. And then when I finished at IBM, I had the choice of, do I stay at IBM, do I go into academia, or do I go into business? And at that time, what I hadn't realized is all these videos I'd been making had created a huge sort of fan base in the rave music scene, which was just emerging at that time on the back of kind of Kraftwerk music. And so I was approached by a very well-known band called The Shaman, who got into a lot of trouble for advocating ecstasy on top of the pops and things. And so I thought, let's see what's happening. Rave music seemed like an emerging scene, and it certainly was. Ibiza was just starting to kick off as a exciting venue. And then I set up a company in Soho. There were 3 of us, and we started to make rave music videos in the style of the art that I'd produced at IBM. And we did very well. And so I thought, up to that point, I thought the art world was always going to be my audience, but actually it was all the people going to raves were the people who were really enjoying my work. And, so that was, and it was great for about 3 years. And then the problem is that if you start, if you're working with the music industry, you start to sell your soul a little bit. The imagery starts to be associated with these rave bands I was working with, not as the artist. A bit like Dr. Faustus, you sort of sold your soul, you're
Yes.
getting the money.
Yes.
And then what happened was that Universal Studios approached me. They'd seen the work I'd done at IBM, these strange organic mutation things, and they said, we'd like you to produce a sequel to a famous film called The Thing, which was by John Carpenter, set in Antarctica. And this film is quite extraordinary because things mutate and severed heads sprout legs and run off. And they say, well, we loved your art at IBM. Will you now do a sequel to this film as a game? And by the way, here's several $1 million to do this, about $5 million. And so then I created a team of about 25 people. And then I, that was a #1 hit, very, very successful, released on PlayStation, Xbox, etc. And then by that point, I suddenly realized I was employing 50 people, and we were approached by Infogrames to do a game. And then very early on, we did for Warner Brothers a version of the organic art that we'd done at IBM for PC. PCs were just emerging then. And that was very, very successful. We saw quite a lot of royalties off the back of that. But as time went on, I was losing my creative identity, and I was more concerned about paying this huge wage bill that all these people that I had working for me. And then after 10 years, I sort of had a kind of an awakening and realized I've got to just get back into an academic research environment where I could have that freedom again. But I guess what I did learn was how to be a kind of business person, how to do a deal, how to work with lawyers, how to close a big deal. So I've learned that along. But that was part always of my idea of independence, never selling out. And then I became a professor initially at Leeds Metropolitan University, and then after 2 years moved to Goldsmiths with Frederick Lemery, who I still work with, was sort of instrumental in enabling that move to Goldsmiths.
It does seem from what you say that one of the things that another interviewee said to me was that digital art finds new audiences. There are people who wouldn't be seen dead in an art gallery, but who relate very quickly to some of the digital things that you can do. But at the same time, you're moving away from high art, as it were. And from what you say, I think you became very conscious of that there was a stage where you weren't doing your proper allowing your proper creativity to be used. You were doing something for an external source, perhaps.
Yes, yeah. So I guess what I hadn't realised is that if you move from art to entertainment, in some ways, if you're working in entertainment, it's very simple because something sells or it doesn't sell. You get an audience response. If you're working in the art world, it's all shades of grey. You have no idea how is anything measured. So initially, I quite liked working in entertainment. Very straightforward. And people seemed to like the visuals that we were doing, and working with the Shame and the different brands. They gave us carte blanche to do whatever we liked. They seemed to like everything we were doing. But the problem is that as time goes on, you become more and more compromised. You don't realize it at the time. And then finally I come back to media art or computer art, and everything's moved on 10 years. And then thankfully I was able to pick up my collaboration with Stephen Todd, who I'd collaborated with it at IBM. And we like 10 years just be wasted. We picked up at exactly the same point. What do we do with this software? It's going to make it interesting from this point onwards.
How do you in fact manage to survive as an artist when your own algorithms are published and people can take them and use them? Does this cause you any problems?
So that's a very good point. So the challenge is if you're backed in a research environment, you have to publish your algorithms. So we wrote a book called Evolutionary Art and Computers where we laid out all the algorithms that we'd used, and people have read that book and re-implemented that. So I see artworks in my style, and I can see that they've just literally taken our algorithm and repurposed it. So that's one of the challenges. If you're being backed by research, then you have to publish, and therefore that encourages you to release the algorithms. Funnily enough, it was very useful for Stephen Todd and and I, because all our software was on tape drives. We couldn't retrieve it. We couldn't retrieve the old IBM software. But thankfully, we'd written a book where we wrote down all our own algorithms. So we went to the book and used the book to re-implement all the algorithms again, and we re-implemented in different languages. I guess the people doing really interesting computer art, they're doing they're using multiple algorithms. So in our VR system, we're using countless algorithms. We're using Perlin noise, we're using Blinn texture surface qualities, we're using a couple of Mandelbrot fractal algorithms, and it's all sort of mixed in together as a sort of intense kind of brew of algorithmic connections, plus everything's running at 90 frames a second. Now, hopefully, once you get that working really well, it becomes a very, very rich experience that people would find pretty hard to copy. But it is true to say there are a number of key algorithms, like Boyd's, the flocking algorithm is pretty key. There's some pretty key machine learning templates that people repeatedly use. I guess part of the artwork is to come up with new algorithms, but actually it's how you combine all these algorithms together and in what proportion to make the artwork.
But is it just a, if you like, a computational question of coming up with new algorithms and getting them to work together, or is there something more behind that, some sort of quote, artistic unquote?
Yeah, so what algorithms appear is based on my aesthetic. So if I want all the walls in our VR space to be completely mirrored, that's what happens, and it's very clear. And then I might say, well, I want little veins of red, breaking those mirrors up. So there is a kind of artistic goal, if you like, which influences what algorithms are written or what technologies used. Now, one of the key things is working with Stephen and Lance in particular is trying to get a feel for what would work well technically, and it's often a compromise. You say, well, we want 1,000 swirling, spawning mutoids. We can do that, but we can't do 10,000. And then, I say, okay, well, I'll go for the lower number, but they need to be richer. They need to have richer colors. So creatively, there's this really good dynamic between aesthetic decision-making and the technology. But I guess the question is the software the artwork ultimately, because that is, any image is just a snapshot, and you could say that when you're in VR enjoying Mutator, it's a bit like enjoying an orchid. It's an ephemeral transitional experience. 5 seconds later it's gone. And so, it's the software that has the potential to create endless possibilities. Maybe the software is the artwork.
We've been looking, the Computer Art Society is looking back over the last 50 years, but is also concerned, I think, about what developments might occur in the next 50 years. I'm just wondering if you have any ideas on that. And for instance, the VR headset problem, do you think there will come a time when there won't be that awkward queue at the gallery to get the headset?
I think ultimately people will have a VR headset permanently in their living room, and it'll probably be like a late night channel that people will go into to relax and meditate or switch off, and as a completely immersive experience where their body movements change the world that they're in. It gets around the problems of having one, or we sometimes have like 4 VR headsets in a museum context, but it would be a kind of home consumer. Probably as more and more people are replaced by machines, be them driverless lorries or taxis, there's going to be more and more leisure time, and I think people will get bored with violent computer games or just computer games per se, and there'll be a kind of opportunity for a kind of truly immersive experience in VR that people might want to, whether you could call it an LSD experience without the LSD, doesn't matter. That I can see one thing that will happen, and yeah, it's a really it's a complex area. You can see you know, in the medical science domain, computers will make some significant breakthroughs. The challenge is people have found that model far more complex to simulate than they anticipated. But no, it's interesting time. You know, I think art in the art world will continue, probably as it is, as sort of. But that's a very hard question to ask about the future. No, I'd say machine learning. You know, machine learning is going to increasingly do more and more, and I think the public will want to verify machine learning. You know, to actually, to get science will have to prove that this machine learning algorithm has worked. But I think in the creative domain, I can see for my work, I'll be using AI to automatically generate alien worlds for the consumer to enjoy. And you know, it is quite a sci-fi kind of vision.
You spoke somewhere about a return to the Renaissance,
yes,
where art and science work hand in hand. And this sounds very much like that in a way.
Yeah, you know, right from the start, I've always worked closely with scientists. You know, back at IBM, with Weatherall Institute, with Imperial College, and it's very interesting that they look at the imagery or VR experiences that I'm producing and say, well, that reminds me of the way this molecule docks with another molecule. Can you take that bit of code and rework it to do what I'm interested in? So all the time I'm bouncing off science, but actually what's interesting is actually we have a version of our work which is hardcore science. It's not art, and that's one of the key things. It is entirely driven by the scientific domain. And I think with the Renaissance art, that was a fantastic period where you had, you know, architects working with painters, creating the illusion of depth, and you know, like in VR, we're creating the illusion of depth, you know, and it's a Trompe-l'oeil effect. So there are lots and lots of similarities. The difference in VR is completely around you, and that's what's interesting.
Yes. Have you had much to do with the Computer Arts Society, if I might ask?
So I was a member of the Computer Arts Society, and in particular John Lansdowne was my PhD supervisor at the Royal College of Art, even though I never finished my PhD. And he ran the monthly meetings, and they were normally at St Martin's in Longacre and on one of the first floors. And so I went for about 4 years regularly to those meetings. And then sadly I went off to IBM in Winchester and stopped going. But John Lansdowne was a great mentor of mine. He really encouraged me to actually start publishing. He got me to write my first academic paper. And then George Mallon I also knew, and yeah, it was a great group. And these, you know, it was really early days of computing.
I mean, I suspect it's having something of a crisis of personality at the moment, because you know it was set up in an age when computing was a really strange thing.
Yes.
Straight out of Doctor Who, as it were. And now computing, as you say, is ubiquitous. We've all got these machines all over the place. And its original role of just bringing people together and defending a very young art form is now no longer necessary. And it's an interesting speculation as to what they're going to do for the next 50 years. Your thoughts on that? Any advice?
I get, you know, definitely getting the history right, I think, is really useful. Like, you know, back then there were probably, you know, 100 people, like in 1992, there were probably 100 people in London that could do animation or Photoshop or anything. You know, it was a very extremely rare skill, and now it's become much wider. I think, you know, getting the record of what happened when, you know, and you know, also including, you know, early computer artists in the US like David M, Kawaguchi in Japan, who I mentioned. You know, there's an interesting kind of lineage, and also trying to identify what the key techniques were that artists were using, like Paul Brown with his cellular work.
Yes. Do you still see a role though in bringing people together, or are there now so many places where like-minded computer artists can come together? Goldsmiths for a start.
Yeah.
Do you see a role for a society which isn't directly connected to any of the universities and which doesn't have any particular connection with any gallery or any company or something like that?
I think it has a role. You know, definitely getting people together to talk about computer art. You know, may need a slightly stronger manifesto to challenge traditional art. You know, I used to go to SIGGRAPH a lot in the early days when John Lasseter was showing his first short films, and all the luminaries would go every year to Los Angeles or Dallas or in the US, and it was great. It was quite everyone would turn up with their algorithms and try and compete against each other. So, but yeah, that was a long time ago. But I think the Computer Arts Society definitely has a role. It might need just a stronger, more combative manifesto to challenge traditional art.
Okay. William Latham, thank you very much indeed.
Great, thanks.